China's essentially made the best of a bad situation. The Africans understand that coronavirus originated in China. There was initially a very negative response from a number of African countries that had significant African communities living in China, particularly in Guangzhou, which has a concentration of Africans, where there were widespread reports of their being treated poorly by local Chinese officials. And those reports got back to Africa and resulted in a great deal of negative publicity, even including initially some criticism from African governments of China. And that's very unusual for African governments to criticize China. The African governments have by and large ended any criticism that they had of how China dealt with these African communities. But African civil society has not relinquished its concerns about how they were treated. So it's left a bit of a negative taste in the mouth, in the collective mouths of those African countries that had large communities in China, particularly countries like Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, several others. In an effort to try to deal with this negative outcome, China began an immediate program of providing COVID-19 assistance throughout Africa, flying in large quantities of protective gear, for example. By and large, that was successful. And I think most of the African countries were appreciative of that effort. They also sent short-term medical teams to a number of African countries, trying to help the Africans combat COVID-19 in their own countries. And then they attached a huge amount of publicity to this effort. China actually provided less by way of funding than the United States did in order to combat COVID-19, but the amount of publicity that China got for it was far greater than the US received through its more along the lines of financial assistance. So in effect, China has recovered reasonably well. There has been one more recent report out of Kenya where some of the protective equipment was substandard, and that resulted in a lot of negative publicity in Kenya. But so far, that has not filtered into concerns in other African countries. So everything considered, it's probably something of a wash for China. They initially had, I think, a generally negative reaction. They worked hard to overcome that. For the most part, I think they have. But still, there are some lingering concerns, particularly among African civil society.